Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 50 Movies, number 20 through 16. I'm doing a series of videos counting down my top 50 favorite movies of my lifetime. In this video, I will count down my number 20 through 16. So number 20 is Reservoir Dogs. Reservoir Dogs is the most simple and also my favorite Quentin Tarantino film. I feel the dialogue-heavy films is something underrated, and people seem to focus too much on the visuals and, spectacle. And I like good stories that focus on the characters and that can build suspense through mostly dialogue. To me, that takes a lot of skill. And Tarantino is known as being a masterful writer of dialogue and also someone who plays with time, as most of his movies play out in a non-linear fashion. Although I do think that Reservoir Dogs is one film that is pretty much plays out like the typical flashback method of storytelling, although Quentin Tarantino apparently gets pissed off if you refer to Reservoir Dogs as a flashback film and prefers to think of it as non-linear, but I'm sorry, it is a flashback film. Non-linear would be more like Pulp Fiction, but regardless of what you want to call it, Reservoir Dogs is a film about a jewelry heist where you never actually see the jewelry heist. You deal mostly with the aftermath and also a bit of the preparation. I love how throughout the film they suspect someone on the crew to be working for the police, and this isn't revealed until towards the end. And then we get the character backstory, which totally makes you look at the whole film in an entirely different light. I love films that can do this. Number 19 is Star Wars Episode 3, The Revenge of the Sith. This film, I think, is a bit underrated as it is often lumped in with the other Star Wars prequels, which were pretty bad, but the way I see it, those two films were really, they weren't really necessary as they were just setting up this film, which was an awesome telling of the origins of the backstory of Darth Vader that needed to be told. And yes, I had the audacity to rank this film higher than A New Hope and Return of the Jedi, because this film has an added element that to me was lacking in the original trilogy, and it's a strong social political message that is relevant to today's society. The original trilogy is simply a story of good versus evil, whereas this film explores the complexity of human interpersonal relationship and explores how there is good and evil in everyone. Besides the obvious of the story of Anakin Skywalker who falls from grace, it's also interesting that the Old Republic was not defeated by the evil empire, that the Old Republic became the evil empire, which to me is the most important factor of this film. And of course, the release of this film was very relevant at the time during the Iraq War, a war many felt was unjustified and just an excuse for a few at the top to gain more wealth and power. We get a story of Emperor Palpatine who basically manufactures this war in order to gain power and subdue the population. It wasn't a coincidence that Palpatine and Darth Vader were saying things that were similar to those said in the Bush administration were saying at the time. My favorite being when Darth Vader says, "You're either with me or you're my enemy," which is similar to what Bush said, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, which to me is the most infamous quote ever uttered by a U.S. president in history. And in this film, Obi-Wan Kenobi replies, "Only a Sith deals in absolutes," which is goddamn right. Anyway, this film executes social political messages at a time when speaking out against the war or the administration was seen as anti-American, which in itself is a large symptom of the problem. So this film was brave in doing so, but even though it wasn't overly overt about it, but that was another great thing about this film, is that it didn't hit you over the head with the sledgehammer with the point like films like Avatar did, but it delivered the message in a strong and efficient way. And on top of that, it managed to tell a very personal and heartbreaking personal story of how Anakin Skywalker turned to the dark side and how it affected the people around him. Although there were some flaws in this film, such as the General Grievous character being completely unnecessary and kind of just a way to throw more action in there, And the end, having to set up the original Star Wars trilogy was sloppily done and a bit too obvious. I feel these films' strengths outweigh its weaknesses. Number 18 is Braveheart. The classic epic war story. Although this film is incredibly historically inaccurate, once you look past that, it manages to tell an incredibly engaging film that chronicles the story of a man devoted to a cause. I personally don't understand the common complaint that this movie is too violent, as I feel the violence is there in service of the story, and it never feels gratuitous or unnecessary to me. It shows the horror of war in that time period and doesn't try to sugarcoat it. The film is just filled with amazing performances and is engaging throughout. Again, you have to look past the historical inaccuracies, as the part about William Wallace's wife being killed was completely made up. He never met Robert the Bruce, and he never had an affair with a princess from France. But as far as great storytelling goes, none of that really matters. If you want, if you want to learn about history, go read a book. If you want a highly entertaining, well-told story that affects you emotionally, then Braveheart accomplishes this better than almost any film you'll see. I particularly appreciate the story about Robert the Bruce and how it was his betrayal that eventually destroyed Wallace and led to his downfall. Also, the performance of Patrick McGoohan as Longshanks King Edward I was particularly amazing. He did one of the best villains in cinematic history. And the ending was just incredible. I mean, who doesn't get choked up when William Wallace yells, "Freedom!" While he's getting tortured? It was just simply amazing. Number 17 is The Prestige. An amazing psychological thriller. This movie, for me, cemented Christopher Nolan as one of my all-time favorite directors, mainly because he is capable of producing some of the most original and thought-provoking material that really stands out from the rest of Hollywood. In fact, when I first heard of the premise of this film being about two rival magicians in the 19th century England, my first thought was to be totally uninterested. But because it was directed by Nolan, I decided to give it a shot, and boy did it pay off. Nolan is another director who is great at telling stories in a non-linear fashion, and he manages to pull this off nicely in this film. And it begins with the apparent murder of the great Danton, but through the course of the story you get the full backstory, which completely changes your perspective on everything. I heard some complaints about this film that it introduces a science fiction fantasy elements towards the end of the film while not introducing itself as a science fiction or fantasy movie. So to these people this felt out of place, but I was perfectly okay with it. I like the idea of crossing genres. I don't feel that this film needed to necessarily introduce itself as a science fiction film in order to introduce fantastical elements. If it was done well, and I thought it was done perfectly. In my opinion, this film has David Bowie's best performance ever as Tesla, who is our introduction to the fantastical elements of the film. And I thought this character was so well written, and he pulled it off so masterfully. It brought an added element to this film that truly made it something special. And the twist at the twist ending, although some felt was predictable, I personally didn't predict it. However, I feel whether it's predictable or not, it's not really the point. The point is about obsession and how it affects the two magicians in very different ways and ultimately destroyed their lives, which I thought was executed brilliantly. And number 16 is Seven. A truly unique crime drama directed masterfully by David Fincher. It was interesting watching some of the DVD extras on this and learning more of the backstory. Apparently, the final script that was used was the second or third draft, which was the draft Fincher read that made him want to direct the film. But apparently the studio had forced the screenwriter to rewrite several more drafts, turning the film into a stereotypical, unoriginal crime drama about detectives kicking down doors and where the detective wins at the end. Thankfully, Fincher talked the studio into making the original version, but before the studios got their hands on it and choked all originality out of it. The result is a crime thriller that is like no other and breaks all traditional Hollywood conventions. I mean, the premise about two detectives tracking down the serial killer who kills people based on the 7 deadly sins is kind of an unoriginal premise, which I could easily see turned into a stereotypical Hollywood crime drama. But instead, they took a totally different and amazing direction with it, with 2 great performances by Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt. Pitt plays the stereotypical meathead cop who's just out there to get the bad guy and be the hero, while Freeman plays a worn-down, contemplative cop who has a less romanticized vision of the world and is mainly, it's mainly through this character we see this crime thriller in a totally different light, as it highlights the darkest aspects of humanity. Another thing I learned from the DVD extras that I found interesting was that the screenwriter who wrote this film based the setting of the film off of his personal experience living in New York City, and which was not at all good. While some people tend to have a romanticized vision of huge cities like New York, I personally hate large cities like that, and I'm sure I would have an experience and a vision of such a large city similar to the screenwriters. And this film certainly does a great job of portraying a horrible and disgusting place that highlights the decay of humanity. And I can't talk about how great this film is without mentioning Kevin Spacey. I know he doesn't appear in it for very long, but when he does, it's truly amazing. And he plays a villain so well and adds an extra element to the film that truly makes this one of the best crime dramas ever made. So that's it for my top 50 movies, number 20 through 16. You should keep an eye out for the remainder videos I had to come to cover the rest of my top 50. So make sure you subscribe to keep up with that, and thanks a lot for watching.